Papa Murphy's $7.99 everyday value lineup of take and bake pizzas are, well, a pretty big deal for a pretty small price. We're talking big savings on big flavors, like our new bold shredded pepperoni pizza, crumbled sausage pizza, or classic cheese pizza, all for the small price of $7.99 each. So head to Papa Murphy's, because with freshly made large pizzas at this price, you can afford to bake a big-time deliciousness all day, every day. Papa Murphy's, change the way you pizza.
This is a Queen Bee Radio High School sports presentation.
It's the Papa Murphys of Platteville and Prairie Chien High School football roundup on the Queen Bee Radio Sports YouTube channel. Our starting lineup today have game will travel Steve Prestegard, Scott Tolzman, and Matthew Goninen with us for this week's episode. And Papa Murphy's lineup, everyday value lineup at $7.99 each, is a big deal for a small price. We're talking a large pizza with new shredded pepperoni, crumbled sausage, or classic cheese for $7.99 each, which means you can afford big-time deliciousness at Papa Murphy's of Platteville and Prairie du Chien. The best way to kind of describe what we saw in last week's high school football action, guys, is that if it wasn't a blowout, it was a shutout. There was not a lot of overly competitive games in our area in southwest Wisconsin, but we had a really weird game that happened in Lancaster on Friday night. Steve, both you and Scott got to call Platteville defeating Lancaster 44-22. Just kind of seeing the texts that were coming in, during the games that I was calling, and seeing what the final score was, that was a drastic swing of events in that matchup. Steve, walk us through it and try and make sense of what happened in that game on Friday night.
Well, for one thing, Lancaster got off to a 19-7 lead early in the second quarter, but unlike other situations that Platteville has seen itself in when they never came back, they did. They got 2 touchdowns in a row right after that and had a lead up until the last seconds of the first half when Lancaster got a field goal and went up 22-21 at the half. What was interesting, though, is how Platteville responded after that. 70 yards in 5 plays, got what turned out to be go-ahead for good touchdown. And then the defense showed up, because in the third quarter, Platteville's defense did not give up a first down. And in the fourth quarter, Platteville gobbled up 3 turnovers. They recovered a fumble and had 2 interceptions. And it's really difficult to come back if you keep turning the ball over, or you don't get any first downs. And that is what Platteville's defense did to Lancaster in both cases.
Yeah, it kind of feels like, seeing the result of that game and how it played out, I feel like we don't really know much has changed between the two teams. We don't know if the team got better or if they got worse. One team, had a, very solid first half, and then Platteville having a very dominant second half. Scott, when you were calling the game and kind of seeing the action, what kind of stood out to you between the two teams, and what do you make of their standing as they head down the home stretch of the SWC?
It was a tale of two halves. Lancaster really played well in the first half, and second half they made the mistakes that Platteville was doing. Turnovers really hurt, but so did a couple timely penalties that kept a few drives going for Platteville that kind of sealed the deal for them. I really thought it would be a closer game, but as it turned out, Platteville was able to capitalize on those mistakes and pull away at the end. And looking at it, they're still both good teams. They're going to both be in the playoffs. Will they have a chance for the championship? It just depends on if somebody can trip up Prairie du Chien, somewhere's down the line. But it's going to be interesting to see. So I think it's going to be a battle of who's going to finish maybe second or third and get those, I want to say bonus points, but get that idea for the seeding when it comes to the playoffs.
Yeah, it does kind of seem like Platteville and Lancaster are kind of at that point where, if someone else can't trip up Prairie du Chien, it's going to have to be up to Lancaster to do it themselves the final week of the season. But with the way that things are starting to shake out in the SWC, we saw what Prairie du Chien did to River Valley on Friday night, 63-8, the final in that contest. Other games in the SWC, Broadhead Judah defeated Dodgeville 45-15, and New Glarus getting a 20-8 win over Richland Center, and it feels like that Prairie du Chien is kind of in a class of their own right now at the top of the conference. And then we have 4 teams tied at 2-1 records in conference play. And Steve, it kind of feels like that those teams that are at 2-1, it's really just kind of fighting to see who can have a better record and who's in a better position for higher seeds once we get to the postseason.
Well, and particularly one of those teams is not going to be 3-1 after this week because Lancaster plays River Valley Friday night. Mm-hmm. So that game is basically an elimination game for whoever loses that game as far as winning the conference, because you're not going to win the conference with 2 losses. Lancaster, of course, hosts Prairie du Chien right at the end of the season. And obviously the Arrows still have time to fix some of their problems. One of them is, and it's weird to say this about a Lancaster team, but rushing. They only had 101 total yards rushing against Platteville, and that's probably half of what you would usually see from a typical Arrows team. Of course, this hasn't been a typical Arrows team because, among other things, they don't have the great big, or they don't have the bruising fullback who is always the number one option in the offense. And their offensive line is not playing as well as it did last year. Of course, they replaced 3 players off that team, so that I guess is not too much of a surprise. But certainly Lancaster's got enough time to fix those things, and games in which they will be favored up until the last game of the regular season against Prairie du Chien. So now, of course, when that game shows up, Lancaster's biggest fans, other than the old Arrows fans, is going to be Platteville, because if Platteville can win out, and they will also be favored, although there's at least one possible game that could be a problem for them. But you could end up still with a possible 3-way tie for first place if the Arrows win out, including beating Prairie du Chien, and Platteville wins out. Conversely, if River Valley wins out, they were just a game behind of first place at this point. But that game on Friday, again, is basically an elimination game as far as being a conference contender, either for or basically for whoever loses against Lancaster or Valley.
Yeah, and one of the things that you were touching on, what was kind of uncharacteristic of Lancaster with rushing, the thing that we kind of pointed to in the first couple of Lancaster games that I got to cover was the rushing defense. And looking at the stats from the game on Friday night, Platteville was able to get 5.6 yards per carry and 178 total rushing yards. So it felt like Platteville was able to do what they needed to do in that rushing attack. And we mentioned a couple weeks ago that Lancaster did make some adjustments defensively as far as personnel, deciding to go with 5 defensive backs as opposed to the traditional defensive alignment that they had going into the first couple games of the season. So very curious to see how that plays out. And as you said, Steve, coming up on Friday night, Lancaster at River Valley. We'll have that game on 97.7 Country WGLR. Also have Richland Center at Platteville on Extreme 107.1. Scott, let's start off with that Lancaster at River Valley game. That seems, I don't know if we want to call it a trap game necessarily, but we saw what happened to Lancaster 2 years ago when they were one of the top teams in the state. I believe they were in the top 10 in Division 6, go into River Valley, who was winless at the time, and then River Valley comes away with the win. Just it seems like getting a win at River Valley isn't an easy feat for a lot of these SWC teams.
No, and you're right. Sometimes some teams get a little bit overconfident in coming into playing a team that's lesser than them, and they kind of play that way, and they make mistakes and end up losing the games. I don't think Lancaster will have that situation this year. They know that you got to work hard to win the game. River Valley is still a little young. I like the way they played. I saw them play Dodgeville, and they have some good kids, and they can make an exciting game. But I think Prairie du Chien exposed them a little bit by the way they handled them that I think Lancaster could probably do the same thing.
All right, then the game on Extreme 107.1, Richland Center at Platteville. Steve, with Platteville coming off that big win against Lancaster, try to keep that momentum going and just kind of keep the Hornets at bay.
Well, in Richland Center, it's kind of hard to tell about them because last year they opened up with 5 losses in a row, but they won 3 of their last 4. And we were actually discussing them as maybe a possible playoff team. They did not end up getting in. They opened this year with a win. They haven't won since, although, certainly they didn't get killed by Lancaster when they lost to them last week. The other thing, obviously, is it's homecoming, and everybody knows, what that means, and everybody knows that you don't want kids out late toilet papering. I said this on the air, and Bryce Artison, the Platteville coach, declined to comment on it, that if you're going to TP, do it early in the night so you get the normal amount of sleep. So there are obviously those sorts of things, but the hope, obviously, from Platteville's perspective, has to be that they can take that second half and use that as momentum against a team that they should beat without too much difficulty. But again, homecoming does weird things, so it's not entirely easy to tell.
Yep. And before we move on to the SWAL, Scott, since you were a former head coach, homecoming week, how much more anxiety is there for the head coaches and for the staff and everyone there kind of tied around everything that goes on that week?
I really didn't care for homecoming, and for my years in Belmont, it was hard because we call it the fair game, and originally we played them on Thursday nights, and there were a few that we actually played away those games, but when we got into Friday night games, the kids still didn't have school that day, but they had to set everything up, and it was kind of disorganized. So I kind of cringed at it. But when I was in Dodgeville, it like Steve said, trying to get the kids to go home early from doing their little pranks and making sure they're behaving. It is a little stressful during the week.
You could just kind of tell, talking to head coaches and athletic directors and stuff like that, homecoming week is, kind of a different animal, and you kind of hold your breath to make sure that everyone, does what they want to do safely and no one gets in trouble and things like that. So I can imagine, the coaches are just trying to keep their teams locked in and understand that their job is what happens on Friday night and making sure that they execute their game plan as intended. So again, our SWC matchups coming up on Friday night, 2 games on Queen Bee Radio, Lancaster at River Valley on 97.7 Country WGLR, Richland Center at Platteville on Extreme 107.1. We'll also keep tabs on Prairie du Chien at Dodgeville and New Glarus at Broadhead, Judah. Let's move into the SWAL, where Cuba City defeated Southwestern East Dubuque 35-0, and Darlington took care of Benton Scales Mount Shelburne 47-0. Cuba City and Darlington pretty much on a collision course to decide the SWAL. Those two will match up on October 11th. We will have that game, by the way, on Super Hits 106 and the Queen Bee Radio Sports YouTube channel. Mineral Point defeated Belleville 27-9, and Galena defeats Fenimore 29-19. Again, Fenimore playing Galena in place of the Abundant Life St. Ambrose game that didn't happen because Abundant Life St. Ambrose is playing 8-player football, not 11-player football. But Matthew, I want to first start off with Cuba City against Southwestern East Dubuque. The Cubans getting a 35-0 win over the Warcats. Cuba City just continues to be dominant in all 3 phases of the game, and they just seem to get little bit better each and every week, something a little bit different for them. And, for the Cubans, it's just maintain and just improve a little bit each and every week. And, just make sure that you don't get distracted and set yourself up for that big matchup in Darlington in a couple weeks.
Yeah, and Tyler, Cuba City, they really know what they're doing every time they step out on the football field. And the thing that helps them is how many weapons they have. Taking a look at what happened last week against Southwestern East Dubuque, who, after having a strong start to the season, ran into some SWAL heavyweights that they haven't seen in the past couple of years. But for Cuba City, They've got the weapons. They can distribute the ball on offense. They can utilize those weapons in different ways to keep defenses that they're playing against guessing. So for them, it's just at this point limiting mistakes and trying not to slip up in any major way before that big deciding game against Darlington in the second week of October.
Yeah, in the game against Southwestern East Dubuque, Tyson Richard got his 19 of 26 passing, 250 yards, and 1 passing touchdown. That touchdown reception to Gavin Vossen, and he left the Holtz, productive day as well. 19 carries, 100 yards, 3 touchdowns. And defensively, 2 interceptions, 1 by Miles Hinderman and 1 by Gavin Vossen. Gavin Vossen now 5 interceptions on the season. He's had an interception in each of the last 4 games. So he is a ball hawk on the defensive side of the ball. And, again, for Cuba City, they got Benton Scales Mount Charlesburg homecoming night on Friday on Super Hits 106 and the Queen Bee Radio Sports YouTube channel. I anticipate that Cuba City is going to just continue to force their will. And one of the things that's kind of interesting about the schedule is that when Cuba City faces someone, they usually end up playing Darlington the week before. So not only does Cuba City have the advantage of getting to see film on their team, they're also keeping tabs on Darlington as the season goes along. So that's a very interesting nugget of information. And again, Darlington taking care of Benton Scales on Charlesburg, no problem, 47-0. Let's talk about that Mineral Point Belleville game on Friday night. Matthew, you got to see that one. Mineral Point coming away with the 27-9 win. A big win for Mineral Point to keep their postseason hopes alive, but as a result of that game and what we learned before we started recording is that Mineral Point did cancel their game this coming Friday night against Lena Winslow due to low numbers and injuries. Kind of walk us through what happened in the game Friday night and what's been going on with the Pointers football team.
Yes, so we'll start with the game against Belleville. It was a huge win for Mineral Point, and going in, it was a game that the Pointers thought they could win and that the Wildcats thought they could win. And the thing that you and I have talked about with Mineral Point all year is just being able to do those little things right. And in that game, all of the little things went their way. They've been going back and forth the last couple of weeks, playing Liam Carey and Reed Ackerman at quarterback, keeping the defenses guessing a little bit there. But after Carey threw an interception on his first drive, they come out with Reed Ackerman under center on their second drive, pitch it to the running back Carey, who throws it downfield for a 60-plus yard touchdown. And Rowan Carey wrapped up the first half with about a 75, 85 yards, somewhere between that, field goal block, which he returned for a touchdown. So all of the little things went right for Mineral Point this week, which is very welcome to them, and it gets them a small victory. And in that game, Jacob Phillips, one of the better linebackers in the area, sustained an ankle injury to his right ankle. And because of that, Mineral Point also had an injury to Keegan Winger. That's 2 starting linemen that they lose. So with that and some other lingering injuries that they've had over the past couple of weeks, they're already getting the forfeit win against Abundant Life St. Ambrose. So they canceled their varsity game against Lena Winslow, Illinois this week. Instead, they'll make a trip to Lena Winslow Monday for a JV game next week.
Yeah, it just feels like Mineral Point the last season and a half just been snake bitten by injuries. And, Jacob Phillips had, I believe he had an injury last year as well, correct?
Yes.
Yep. So, yeah, and we know how great of a player Jacob Phillips is in on both sides of the ball, and that's a very key piece for Mineral Point. And again, it's a numbers game with these smaller schools and things like that. And it's just unfortunate that just due to the injuries and numbers, Mineral Point doesn't get to play a game. But the good thing is that they do get the forfeit win, and that does still help them with potential playoff positioning and with some winnable games on their schedule down the line as well that can help get them ready for a potential postseason run. So we'll keep tabs on the Pointers there. And then, of course, Galena defeating Fenimore 29-19. Very interesting about Fenimore coming up here. Fenimore is, looking at where they are at in the standings. They are 2-1 and 2-3 overall. They got a couple of games coming up with Cuba City and Darlington. They have Darlington coming up this Friday night, so those 2 games probably not going to be in their favor. But if Fenimore wants to keep their season alive and have a chance at the postseason, all the other games they're a must win the rest of the way. Matthew.
Yeah, and that's a tough part for Fenimore is they did have some winnable games early on. They played Benton Skills, Mount Schulzberg already, and they got their forfeit win. But for the rest of the season, it's Darlington, Cuba City, Belleville, and Mineral Point. So as you mentioned, those two games against the two leading teams in the SWAL, not going to make any speculations, but those are going to be really tough games for Fenimore. So then it's just going to be finding a way to compete against Mineral Point and Belleville going into those games with the mindset that they can stay in those games and to potentially win in those games, because without wins those 2 weeks, it's going to be pretty much impossible for Fenimore to find their way into the postseason.
Yeah, should be interesting how it shakes out the rest of the way. Again, the game's coming up on Friday night in the SWAL. Benton Seals on Charlesburg at Cuba City. That game on Super Hits 106 and the Queen Bee Radio Sports YouTube channel. Also, Fenimore at Darlington, and Southwestern East Dubuque goes to Belleville. Let's move into the Six Rivers, but as Steve will call it, the Nine Rivers Conference for geographic purposes. And the way that the Six Rivers teams played, the top three teams won very handily. The teams at the bottom did not. Potosi-Cassville took care of Boscobel 50-6. Blackhawk Warren shuts out Iowa Grant 62-0. River Ridge wins on homecoming night, shutting out Riverdale 39-0. And then Steve and Scott, you got to see Seneca Wazeeka Steuben beat Peck Argyle 37-12. Not a whole lot of surprises, I don't think. I think the question is, one, who's that fourth team in the Six Rivers? Because we kind of thought going into the season it'd be Seneca Wazeeka Steuben, but they fell to Iowa Grant. But now maybe Seneca Wazeeka Steuben finding some momentum, getting a nice win against Peck Argyle, and potentially putting themselves in a spot to make the postseason. Steve.
That's right. The game Saturday was a little bit of a throwback with the Blue Golds. I'm going to call them the Blue Golds to avoid that. Was it Wazeeka Steuben first or Seneca first? But the Blue Golds, they run a wing T offense, and they ran the ball a lot, and they threw pretty successfully, and their defense played pretty well. It was a close game at the half because after the Blue Golds got a 20-0 lead, Peck Argyle came back with 2 touchdowns in the second quarter. So it was 20-12, but one at the half. But one theme that we have seen, we saw it this week with Platteville and Lancaster, and we also have seen it numerous other times, is maybe the most important part of the game is the first drive of the second half when you get the football. That didn't turn out very well for the Vikings. They didn't get anything, and the Blue Golds went down to score and then added 10 more points to make it, a 37-12 game in which a couple of, rain fell a couple of times and all that. But, you got to think at this point that fourth team, it's either going to be the Blue Golds or Iowa Grant. And it's going to be interesting to see which it is. Now, the thing that the Blue Golds have to watch is they really need to win this. Well, they got 2 games this week that are in the next 2 weeks. Blackhawk Warren, Potosi-Cassville. So they're tied for third now. They're not likely to be tied for third in 2 weeks. So that makes the rest of their season then quite interesting. And if they end up in a tiebreaker of any sort with Iowa Grant, since Iowa Grant beat them, that is not obviously to the Blue Golds' advantage.
Yeah, very interesting to see how that's going to play out, who that fourth team is and whether or not they do make it into the postseason. You would think that just because of the reputation and how competitive that Six Rivers Conference is, you'd think that they get the benefit of the doubt if there are any tiebreakers. But, computerized seeding and the WIA, you just never really quite know how it's going to pan out. So we'll keep tabs on that. The matchups coming up this week in the Six Rivers: Potosi-Cassville is at Iowa Grant, Blackhawk Warren is at Seneca Wazeeka Steuben, River Ridge at Boscobel, and Peck Argyle goes to Riverdale. Again, Potosi-Cassville and Blackhawk Warren tied at the top of the conference with 3-0 conference records. Potosi-Cassville, the number 1 ranked team in Division 7, and I believe Blackhawk Warren is ranked number 4. So, and again, those two will be on a collision course at the end of the regular season, the final week, seemingly to decide the Six Rivers Conference or the Nine Rivers Conference at the end of the season. So we'll keep tabs on those games and get you scores on that next week. Let's move into 8-player football, where Highland took care of Kickapoo Lafarge 70-0. And I don't want to say it was a nice bounce back for Highland because they haven't really had a game to bounce back from, but they did have a competitive game the previous week, winning 36-28. But boy, did the Highland Cardinals get things back on the right track. A nice shutout win. Belmont gets a narrow victory over Wanawak Weston 8-7. And then North Crawford defeating Monticello 52-0, and Wisconsin Heights defeating DeSoto 52-12. And Steve and Matthew, both of you have the privilege of calling the game on Saturday that we will have on Extreme 107.1. The Highland Cardinals hosting Wanawak Weston on homecoming day for Highland Cardinals. And Steve, I've called a homecoming game at Highland. You've called quite a few the last few seasons. Highland already is an awesome place to call a game from, but Highland on homecoming is another level of festivities and celebration and things like that. And with the matchup that Highland draws, I would anticipate that it's going to be a very festive crowd at Tyler Field on Saturday.
Yeah, definitely. Matthew will be happy to know that I have already emailed and asked to reserve 2 steak sandwiches for Saturday afternoon. Because they're as good as advertised, believe me. Here is the thing that's interesting about this game. Okay, yeah, it's homecoming, but and Highland has lost on homecoming in the past, but I think they generally win more often than they did win last year. The thing you don't want to do if you're Highland is to slip up because of what happens next week, which is, they go to North Crawford, and at the moment, both teams are undefeated, and that's going to decide most likely the Ridge and Valley 8 title. The thing with Highland is that they have weapons unlike you see most 8-player teams have. And, there's been talk that it's not clear, believe it or not, how long Highland is going to remain by itself as an 8-player team due to numbers. But, they had almost everybody back from a team that won the Ridge and Valley last year. So their quarterback, Bennett Olson, has had an incredible year. Obviously, he likes playing on a field where there are 3 fewer defenders. And so, he's just gone crazy this year, basically. I think Wanawak Center Weston might be, and this is a horrible sports cliche, but they might be better than their record because, yeah, they only have 1 win. But they really gave fits to Belmont, obviously, before Belmont got the win. I believe I've only seen one other game ever in 8-player football that had a score like that, 8-7. That's crazy. So they might be a little better than their record indicates, but Highland, has all kinds of incentive to play well because of what's at stake if they win this game. And so that would be, I'm sure that's going to be a theme this week at Highland football practice.
Yeah, definitely. Wanawak Center Weston at Highland coming up on Saturday on Extreme 107.1. The Belmont Braves hosting North Crawford, the defending conference champion in the Ridge and Valley 8. A tough test for the Braves coming up on Friday night. Also in the Ridge and Valley 8, DeSoto is at Monticello, and Kickapoo Lafarge is at Wisconsin Heights. So that wraps up our previews and recaps for last week and this week. Let's move into our teams of the week, and I'll go first, Steve, then Matthew, then Scott. I have a team of the week. It was the one that we talked about at the beginning, the Platteville Hillman, just getting that big win against Lancaster. Steve, your team of the week.
I agree, and they're not on the high five. But, Platteville, we know that they have been a very inconsistent team, and we know they didn't look good at all last week previous against Prairie Chien. And the thing about Friday was that they were set up to fail in a sense because they've had tight games and they weren't able to finish. You look at the Merrill Point game, which I have to think they think at this point now, they could have won that game. They shut out Merrill Point for 3 quarters, but gave up the 2 scores in the 4th quarter. But in the second half, the defense, got the job done. And I think that Bryce Arneson's old coach, Mike Emmendorfer at UW Platteville, was fond of saying the comebacks start with defense, because if you don't get a stop, all you're doing is, trading points, and that doesn't work if you're down 2 scores. They were down 19-7 after the second quarter. They were down then just 1 at the break. They actually had the lead, and then in the second half, they, as we said, they stopped. They did not give up a first down in the third quarter, and they grabbed 3 turnovers in the fourth quarter, and that is a season-defining win if they build on the momentum from that.
Yep, agreed. Matthew, your team of the week.
My team of the week is also going to be the Platteville Hillmen, for the simple fact that there's a chance, keyword chance, they can be in the running in the SWC. Obviously, Prairie Chien looks really, really strong, but they play Lancaster week 9. Right now, Platteville has that one SWC loss to Prairie Chien. But the interesting thing is Platteville starting 0-2, unable to score any points during the non-conference play, getting that huge win over Lancaster. As Steve said, kind of a season-defining win for Platteville, and it's really going to set them up well as they go into the back half of conference play and look to make a push to finish around the top of the SWC and get a good seed in the playoffs.
All right, and then Scott, are we going 4 for 4 with Platteville?
Yeah, I would say that they came out and got a big win against Lancaster, and those two teams always have good games. Last year was a 1-point victory was it Platteville, if I remember right?
Yeah.
And they've always, those games, you never know. I mean, Platteville came out and played. I think it might have turned the corner for them for the rest of the season. But I still would like to give a little shout out to Mineral Point, though. Mineral Point has been playing a little bit better, and they beat Belleville to keep their playoff hopes up. So I think they can sneak into the playoffs too.
All right, those are the teams of the week. Let's talk about our players of the week. I have 2 in mind. I'm curious to see if any of you 3 match up with any of them. Steve, your player of the week this week.
Well, I have 5 of them. The Platteville offensive line. They have been maligned this year. They've been kind of racked with injuries, or they've had injuries. I don't know about racked, but they've dealt with injuries this year. But against Lancaster, they had 504 yards of offense, which is pretty good. And as a matter of fact, there were 2 drives in the second half where they were trying to do what Lancaster usually likes to do, which is grind it out. And they succeeded in that, except for the fact that they threw 2 touchdown passes. But they were able to, leisurely go up to the line of scrimmage and watch before the official said, you got 5 seconds to run the play. And they ran a play and they went back up. And so they were able to actually eat a fair amount of clock in the second half while moving the ball and scoring. So I think the offensive line for Platteville gets my award.
All right. I like it. Matthew, your player of the week.
Before I give my player of the week, I'd just like to point out that, ladies and gentlemen, we just witnessed some history. Is before our high five teams, we get our high five players from Steve. But in terms of my player of the week, I'm going to go with Caden Washaw from Highland. So the interesting thing with Highland, they get the 70-0 win. They threw 9 passes in the whole game. Part of the reason that they were able to throw so few passes is Caden Washaw, 5 rushing attempts, almost 200 rushing yards. He averaged about 40 yards per attempt and punched it into the end zone 4 times. So solid performance for him.
He was one of the 2 that I had, so I like that one. Scott, your player of the week.
The running back from Platteville is Sicey. I liked him, but you know what? I'm going to go with Platteville's defensive line. They shut down the running game of Lancaster and forced them to have to throw. And Platteville was able to capitalize with a couple of interceptions because they couldn't run the ball. And they were doing something that's very unusual for Lancaster, is throwing more than what they usually do.
All right, I like it. The other player that I had in mind was Joe Haas of Potosi Cassville, similar to what Caden Washa did for Highland. He had 6 attempts for 193 yards and 1 rushing touchdown, 32.2 yards per carry. So very productive when he had the football in his hands. But like Matthew, you were saying, Caden Washa, you touched the ball 5 times, you put it in the end zone 4 times, and you get 200 yards or close to that on the ground. That's not a bad day of work. So those are the players of the week for this week. And now it's time for Steve's High Five, where, again, Steve kindly ranks our area teams 1 through 5, and the rest of us mercilessly tell him why he is wrong. And, Steve, I know that you have put in a lot of work and a lot of effort trying to figure out what the High Five was going to look like this week, and it sounds like by the looks of it, you did all that work and there were no changes on it.
Correct. The City 5th, Darlington 4th, Blackhawk Warren 3rd, Prairie du Chien 2nd, Potosi Cassville number 1. As you pointed out, there wasn't a close game in all of that grouping. So there's no reason to change anything because nothing really changed.
Yep, that sounds about right. Matthew, Scott, any thoughts on Steve's High Five for this week?
Well, I'll tell you what, Steve and I talked about this. I would agree with his 5 picks, but I would rearrange them a little bit. I would put Prairie du Chien number 1, Potosi Cassville number 2, Darlington 3, Blackhawk Warren 4, and then 5. That would be a kind of a toss-up for me yet. Yeah, because there's been some teams that are out there that, have been playing good. They just run into buzzsaws yet.
Right.
So yeah, the City would probably be 5.
Yeah, Matthew, your thoughts on the High Five?
I'm actually okay with it this week. I think that, as Steve said, a lot of blowouts this week, so can't really move any teams around a lot. And I think pretty clear cut, we see who the best 5 teams in our area are. We'll give a mention to Highland in the 8-man. I don't know whether or not they're allowed to be included in the top 5, but with the 5 that you got, works for me.
Yeah, the only thing that I would offer as, an additional, thought to this is that, having seen Cuba City play quite a bit so far this season, Cuba City to me this year feels like Platteville last year, that they have, the senior laden team that, there were, probably some high expectations, internally, and they were probably, figured to be, a contender to, dethrone Darlington at the top of the conference, but just how deep they are and, how many players that they can, rotate in. We were seeing it during the game on Friday night where Cuba City doesn't necessarily do a platoon swap or anything. They just rotate 2 or 3 players at a time to make sure that their starters, get their rest, they stay healthy, and everyone kind of gets a little bit of the action, so that way if their number is called, they're ready to go. And I really think that when that matchup comes up with Darlington on October 11th, Cuba City is going to bring it, and Darlington needs to be prepared. So I think Cuba City has the makings of something very special and a potentially deep postseason run in D6. I'm very curious to see what the final scores of the games are lining up. And like I said earlier, it just feels like that they keep getting better, just incrementally, slight little tweaks to just improve their game, getting better each and every week. So that's my thought on that. I think 1 through 5, it's fine as is. It's hard to decide which blowout was best to move teams, but yeah, I will say Cuba City, I certainly think needs to be in the High Five, but make sure that you're still paying attention to them. Just because they're in that 5 spot doesn't mean that they're a bad team by any stretch of the imagination. So that's Steve's High Five for this week. Now it's time to talk about the first round of the Papa Murphy's of Platteville and Prairie du Chien Mascot Challenge. And boy, oh boy, was this a fun contest to keep tabs on when we launched it last week. I will say that based on the results of the ballots that came in, we do ask, for name and, school or alma mater. And I will say a certain school with the mascot pointers had a lot of influence in how this poll shaped out. Looking at the results, starting off with the Lancaster bracket, the number 32 seeded Linden Miners defeated the South Wayne Vandals 118-74. The Basketball Bulldogs 98, the Gratiot Hilltoppers 94, and the Montfort Hilltoppers advance over the Riverdale Chieftains 108-84. In the Darlington bracket, the West Grant Falcons barely sneak by the Benton Zephyrs 98-94, a 36-29 matchup because it's a 46 team seeded bracket. It's all over the place. The Livingston Lions defeated the Fenimore Golden Eagles 107-85. The Merrill Point Pointers take care of the New Diggings Midgets 126-66. And the Bloomington Blue Jays 112. The Argyle Orioles 80. In the Blackhawk Warren bracket, the Rui Eagles advance over the Fenimore Mighty Midgets 127-65. The Bagley Indians take down the Southwestern East Dubuque Warcats 113-79. And the Patch Grove Beavers, lifelong Patch Grove Beavers fan over here, they defeated the Seneca Wazeeka Blue Golds 130-62. And then in the Cassville bracket, the Wazeeka Steuben Hornets fell to the Spring Green Shamrocks 99-93. Potosi Cassville, the number 46 seed, because they don't technically have a mascot, took care of the Cuba City Cubans 117-75. The Cobb Colonels 138 over Benton Scales Mound. Schallsburg Knights is 54. And the Mount Hope Red Devils take down the Pecatonica Vikings 102-90. The theme that I'm seeing here is that a lot of the teams that are affiliated with the SWAL got eliminated, probably because a certain school decided to post on their social media and call on Pointer Nation to get out and vote. So I have to ask you, Matthew Goninen, was there a specific strategy or something in the minds of Pointer Nation when they decided to submit their ballots?
You know, I will say that as we were looking at how we were going to promote the mascot challenge on the district social media, our Blue Crew social media, Wake Up Mineral Point, anywhere we could put it, one of the asterisks that we put on the bottom was make sure to vote against our rivals. Makes it a little easier for the Pointers going forward. So, yeah, very happy in a sense to see some of the area rivals fall in week one, and the Pointers were one of the highest scoring teams of the week in the mascot challenge.
I guess we now know that Mineral Point fans kind of have the same attitude that I've always had about the Big Ten at the Rose Bowl. See, I'm old enough to remember, Scott is probably old enough to remember also, when Wisconsin would just get pounded by Michigan and Ohio State every year. And then Michigan and Ohio State would end up in Pasadena. And I would sit there in my living room and root against them. I would root for, places I'd never been, USC, UCLA, Washington, whatever, in order for the Big Ten to die at the Rose Bowl. And as it happened, I usually got my wish. So apparently Mineral Point fans have that same sort of, I don't care about this conference buddiness and that sort of thing, I suppose.
Well, yeah, it certainly seems to be that way. It seems like Mineral Point, if they're going to come away at the pizza party, they want to make sure that none of the SWAL teams have an opportunity at that. Scott, go ahead.
Yeah, when I did my voting, I voted by the uniqueness of the names and gave my vote to those. The Mighty Midgets, the Red Devils. All those names that we don't even see anymore. Those got my votes because it's pretty interesting for those small little towns with some of the nicknames they use.
Yeah. The sad thing from my perspective, of course, is that the team I was touting last week, the New Diggings Midgets, got punted right away. Of course, that then saves the question of where New Diggings now is, because I have not actually seen anything that indicates that whether New Diggings was absorbed by Southwestern or Benton or Schallsburg or what. So this is now not a problem because they're not going to be getting the 10 free pizzas, but it would be kind of an interesting investigative challenge there to try to find out where New Diggings got absorbed into. And I can see, fighting, well, no, they're ours, because everybody wants the 10 free pizzas, but that's not an issue. Sad.
I did see a comment on one of the posts that it was Schulzberg that absorbed them, if I remember correctly. So I think that's where the pizzas would have gone had they won. But again, the other sub storyline besides, the fact that Pointer Nation, kind of flooded the ballot box was that the two midget mascots fell short in this. And Steve, I know you appreciate that pun I just laid on you.
Yes. Well, you also noticed that the Hilltoppers toppled a team in one particular case, but the Hilltoppers got toppled. I think the Miners buried somebody, if I'm not mistaken, in the polling.
We could go on all day. We really could.
Yeah.
But there's only so much episode.
Our inner Van Scout from Channel 3.
What's that?
We're channeling our inner Van Stout from Channel 3. He was a longtime sports director at Channel 3.
Yep.
And he inevitably would say, for instance, Mount Horeb toppled Verona and, things like that when he was doing the high school scores.
Yeah, which, after round one, we have some very intriguing round two matchups coming up here. Let's look at the Lancaster bracket. Again, Lancaster, the number one overall seed. They take on the Linden Miners in the voting. And then in the bottom half of that part of the bracket, the number 16 seeded Prairie du Chien Blackhawks take on number 17 seeded Richland Center Hornets. We also see the number 9 seeded Potosi Chieftains taking on the Basketball Bulldogs and the number 8 seeded Schulzberg Miners taking on the Montfort Hilltoppers. Anyone have any thoughts or anything related to the Lancaster bracket with the matchups that we have there?
Well, it's not specifically about that, but you did point out that Potosi Cassville doesn't have a mascot for their football program, and which obviously would also go with the girls basketball team similarly, which makes you think maybe we should come up with one for them.
Yeah, I don't know if there's a great way to combine Chieftains and Comets. If we can find a way to make it work and make a logo happen with it, I'm sure that there's some AI technology or something like that we can leverage to make that happen. But yeah, I think we might be open to suggestions, and maybe that's something that we do for next week. Maybe offer a suggestion for a potential mascot name for Potosi Cassville. Maybe there's another contest in the making there. We'll see how it goes. Let's go to the Cassville bracket, the number 4 overall seed. This is where I think the tournament gets interesting because both in this bracket and in the, I believe, Blackhawk bracket, we will see a couple schools go head-to-head where Cassville will take on the number 36 seed West Grant Falcons. And then also in that bracket, we see the Livingston Lions take on the Belmont Braves. Belmont, the number 13 seed. Livingston, the number 45 seed. We also have the Peck Argyle Vikings taking on Matthews Mineral Point Pointers. And then the Iowa Grant Panthers, the number 5 seed, taking on the Bloomington Blue Jays. A few rival schools going head-to-head in the voting for that. And Matthew, since... again, Pointer Nation really showed out in the brackets. Is there kind of an ideal matchup that you think the Pointers are looking for potentially down the line? And do you think Pointer Nation is going to answer the call and make sure that they advance for this week?
Well, first of all, Tyler, I'm happy to report that at around 6 o'clock tonight, a post went up promoting round 2 of the voting for Mineral Point. So don't worry, we're already on that.
That explains the buzzing of my phone in my pocket then.
Yes, of course. It's going to be interesting coming up. There's a potential matchup if the stars align against the Iowa Grant Panthers, two fairly good swall rivals in that one right next to each other. They've got a lot of history and a lot of sports, so that'd be interesting to see in that bracket. I mean, elsewhere in the bracket, you've got some pretty solid fan bases. I expect, obviously, seeing Potosi Cassville do really well, that Cassville is going to do really well with the strong fan base that they've got. I'll give it a shout out to the Livingston Lions. I hope to see them do well. But besides that, just some really interesting matchups and some interesting mascots still in play in the Cassville bracket.
The only thing I'll say is that with Cassville and West Grant, a team in green is going to win. People might remember West Grant used to be green, and so whenever Cassville would play West Grant, similar to Cassville playing Benton, now it sort of looked like an inter-squad game. And it was kind of weird to have in the old Blackhawk Conference and then the Six Rivers West, 3 teams being green, and you got to look hard to find green in most places, but 3 of them were green back in the old Black days.
Yeah, like I said, I think it's very interesting that whoever wins that West Grant Cassville matchup, the affiliated school will also win the River Ridge Potosi Cassville matchup. I'm pretty sure that the votes will be exactly the same, at least from those communities. So I'm kind of curious to see how the voting plays out for that. Let's move into the Darlington bracket, where the Redbirds are the number 2 overall seed. They take on the Rui Eagles after upsetting the Fenimore Mighty Midgets in round 1. We also see the 15-seeded Dodgeville Dodgers taking on the 18-seeded River Valley Blackhawks. The 10-42 matchup, the Seneca Indians versus the Bagley Indians. That's a coin flip. And then the Highland Cardinals, the number 7 overall seed, taking on the Patch Grove Beavers. Again, another bracket with some really fun mascots and some intriguing matchups. Scott, what do you make of this Darlington bracket?
Like I said, I voted for the unique mascots, and I would like to see the Beavers win it. There's not too many schools that use the nickname Beavers, and I can only think of one, and that's Augusta. And the Dodgers, Beaver Dam Beavers, I forgot about them, but Dodgers might have a little shoe in there too, a little bit, because that's kind of a unique name too. But it's going to be interesting to see how people vote on these things and what they feel. Like I said, if they do like I do with the unique mascots, they're not voting just for their own school.
Yeah, I'm very curious about, a team like Highland where, again, there's not a whole lot of, kids and maybe a lot of, community members. The pool isn't quite as big as, some of the other communities in the area. So I'm wondering how many times are they going to vote to, try and get their teams to pull through. So I think it might be a numbers game, for that because, again, it's a numbers game for football normally on the field. It's kind of the same when it comes to voting in this poll as well. So very curious to see how a team like Highland performs in this bracket. Let's go into the final bracket, the Blackhawk bracket, where the Blackhawk Warren Warriors are the number 3 overall seed. They take on the Spring Green Shamrocks. I'm very curious how that one's going to play out. Shamrocks, seemingly a very popular team nickname in this area. We also have Potosi Cassville, again, taking on the 14-seeded River Ridge Timberwolves, as if that rivalry is not already big enough. The Southwestern Wildcats, the 11 overall seed, taking on the Cobb Colonels. I believe the Cobb Colonels had the highest overall total of votes from round 1. So very curious to see if they advance. And then the Platteville Hillmen will get their first opportunity to earn votes. They take on the Mount Hope Red Devils. And Steve, what stands out to you about the Blackhawk bracket?
Well, I mean, you got 2 that you don't ever see anymore, Shamrocks, and you get the Red Devils, obviously. I will just point out what I said last week, which was that Platteville's mascot is unique because it is one of only 2 schools, Prairie to Chien being the other, that has a mascot named for a real person. And in Prairie's case, it's Chief Blackhawk. And in Platteville's case, it's Coach Hill, who the teams are literally named for because he was the football coach, he was the basketball coach, track coach, and the baseball coach. And his coat, which said, it was the coat he wore to games, it said Platteville on the back. His coat is now with the school district. It was donated, purchased, and then donated to the school district. So it'll be interesting to see if a real mascot does well versus, the defunct mascots. No more Red Devils and no more Shamrocks. But that's one thing I find interesting about River Valley. I say this every week or every time that a team I'm covering goes to River Valley, which is that, you had the Shamrocks, you had the Lone Rock Rockets, and you had the Arena Purple Knights get together to form River Valley, and they came up with Blackhawks a bird. It seemed like a little unimaginative to me, at least.
Yes, that's an interesting, perspective on that, because it does seem like that, there's multiple teams that have Black Hawks and Chieftains, and there's, multiple, programs that, kind of share the same mascot name, or at least the same team name. What I'm curious to know is, Matthew, you mentioned, for Mineral Point voting against your rivals. How do you determine who to vote for when you have, say, a Southwestern team taking on the Cobb Colonels, which would be affiliated with Iowa Grant? Is there kind of a hierarchy as far as which ones you absolutely have to vote against, or do you just say it's kind of a coin flip, do what you need to do?
I mean, I'd say it's kind of a coin flip. It's up to the individual voter on that one. One thing I was going to point out is I think that the schools that have come together to form Iowa Grant have some of the coolest mascots. I mean, you talk about the Colonels, the Hilltoppers, the Miners, some pretty unique ones there, but also some very tight-knit communities that form the Iowa Grant School District. So we'll see how well they do. And as you mentioned, Cobb, they got the most votes out of any mascot in week 1. So that might spell trouble for Southwestern, who I was sad to see the Warcats lose after week 1. Like, as we mentioned, that's how you do a co-op mascot right. If you're not going to come up with something new, you make the coolest combination of the two schools as you can, which they did. But this is the last chance for Southwestern to stay in this one, and arguably one of the toughest opponents they're facing. So they're going to need quite the voter turnout if they want to keep their chances of that pizza party alive.
Yeah, it's kind of interesting because, when you factor in, Iowa Grant and River Ridge, I mean, those schools have multiple opportunities across multiple brackets to earn themselves a pizza party and the bragging rights of winning the 2024 football mascot challenge. And I am very intrigued about how the voting is going to go. Not necessarily which schools vote for which, but which schools vote against their rivals and stuff like that. Sometimes it's not about voting who you like, it's voting against who you don't like, which somewhat kind of seems the same for any election in 2024 nowadays anyway. But
what makes me now, I'm starting to wonder, is this going to turn into like 80s professional wrestling or something like that? Are we going to have Mean Gene Okerlund and Gordon Soley coming out and having to play referee with guys who are like screaming at the camera about how they're going to take down the little Shamrocks or something like that? That would be a different dimension for this.
I will put this out there. I was thinking about this earlier today, and this is something that I would love to bring to the athletic directors and coaches, the ones that are watching. What if we had a basketball tournament where we could bring back, old uniforms and, classic names for teams like River Ridge, like Iowa Grant and stuff like that, where you can pay homage to some of those, predecessor teams and things like that. I think something like that, as far as a basketball tournament kind of themed around those throwback jerseys would be really cool. And, giving credit to some of those schools and programs that had some success. I think that'd be something really cool. Not sure how you can do that for football. I mean, schools are, it's tough to find enough players to do a tournament style or something like that. But I think basketball or something like that, that'd be a cool way to do that. So yeah, that's a suggestion out there. And then the voting is live now for round 2. You can go to any of our Queen Bee Radio websites, WGLR.com, X1071.com, SuperHits106.com, and AM1590 WPVL.com. If you can't find it right away with the little pop-up that shows up on the bottom of the screen, just look under the contest tab and vote. You can vote as many times as you would like. Do what Matthew and Pointer Nation did. Get it out. Encourage people to vote. Encourage who to vote for. Do what you got to do to manipulate the ballot to earn your school 10 family-sized Papa Murphy's pizzas. I'm not trying to make it take away Mineral Point's game plan here, Matthew. But yeah,
I feel like we're gonna have a target on our back now. We might have to cut this part of the show and wait till the mascot challenge is over. Just a reminder to everybody watching this and voting. Keep that in mind. But let's also appreciate the mascots here.
Mm-hmm.
Some good ones like the Pointers.
Absolutely.
Oh,
I
I
like
think
it.
the Colonels is the top.
I'll give a shout out to Cobb there. That
mascot,
is very cool.
the cob of corn running around the field.
And in the era now where schools have actual mascot costumes, it is truly unfortunate that that is not something that we have anymore in our area, is a kernel of corn, a cob of corn mascot.
Iowa Grant could bring it back. They could. They don't have to stick with the Panthers. They don't necessarily have to.
The ball's in their court.
Exactly.
Well, I'm certainly, I would bet, I hate to spend other people's money, but I would think if they made a switch, they could probably get some help financially from big corn company in Livingston, I would bet.
It's a marketing opportunity. It definitely is.
That's right.
Chance. So, yep, again, round 2 voting available on our Queen Bee Radio websites. Again, go to our websites, vote as many times as you'd like. Encourage your friends and family to vote. Do what you can to get your teams and your favorite mascots through to round 3. And we're looking forward to recapping the results of round 2 on next week's edition of the Papa Murphy's of Platteville and Prairie du Chien High School Football Roundup on the Queen Bee Radio Sports YouTube channel. For Steve, Matthew, and Scott, I'm Tyler Diktanas. Thanks for joining us, and we'll see you next week.